right off the top before we get into this. Yeah,
You mentioned, or on the video last week, mentioned that the growth of Christianity, well, like goes from 1 million to 6 million just over a short period of time. Well, isn't the main reason for that is because the emperor decides it's going to be a Christian nation, and so he dictates that everybody's a Christian unless they object, and then they have ways to convince people.
that figure that he poses, that 6 million figure, is before the emperor converts to Christianity. That's right on the eve. I think it's right around the year 300 before Constantine actually converts. So it's going to become much larger after that, immediately after the emperor converts in 312. But that figure that he posted, 6 million, is before the conversion of the emperor. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. This is the imperial politics and religion. This is, he talks here in this particular lecture, and his father, Luke Timothy Johnson, he teaches theology at Emory University. He's very, very good. And he's going to talk about the politics leading up to the conversion of the Emperor Constantine the Great, and he's just going to begin to start talking about the implications for this massive conversion. And then he's going to follow this next week with Constantine and the established church. So let's go ahead and get started here with any look at all. This will do something. Wait, I need to use the other one. No, this all I'm doing here. Let's see. Oh, I know. I'm playing. There we go. That's going to do it right there. With any look at all. There. All right. Bob, could you get the lights?
With the topic of imperial politics and religion, we now make a major turn in this course, just as the history of Christianity made a major turn in the 4th century. From this point forward, it will be difficult to disentangle Christianity as a religion from Christianity's role in the political order. In this presentation, we see how in one of history's surprising and unexpected turns, the persecuted Christian cult becomes, in the 4th century, the established religion of the Roman Empire. The transition is represented by the emperors under whom the last persecution was carried out, Diocletian, whose dates as emperor are 284 to 305, and the one under whom toleration and much more occurred, Constantine I, called the Great, whose reign was from 306 to 337. But history is not merely a matter of great men, however important they might be. Beneath their actions, powerful social forces were at work. The Roman Empire's transition from pagan to Christian is more gradual than is sometimes thought and far more complex. We have already seen how Christianity had grown in numbers, reaching a population of over 6 million by the beginning of the 4th century, had grown extensively in its organization, and had grown in its intellectual self-confidence over the 2nd and 3rd centuries. The consequences of Constantine's decision to establish Christianity as the imperial religion were, however, for both empire and church, undoubtedly decisive. Nothing was ever again the same for either. The empire, which had already left far behind its republican roots with the first Caesars, and had become increasingly autocratic, found itself the patron of a religion with subversion in its genes. It is not at all clear that the emperors had any idea how resistant to imperial control Christianity could be, or how much this religion could be divisive from within and thus threaten the order of the empire. From the other side, the church, which had flourished as a religious movement during centuries of oppression and persecution, had flourished, moreover, as a religion committed to peace and nonviolence, along with other counter-cultural values, now found itself the pillar and support of the world's mightiest military and political power. It never did completely resolve the internal tensions this new status created. In fact, it could be argued that the church today, in what is often called a post-Constantinian era, continues to grapple with what is essentially and authentically religious in the Christian tradition, after its political framework no longer is in existence. In some respects, Diocletian is as important a player in this process as Constantine in the shaping of imperial Christianity. For Diocletian gave a new shape to imperial politics. It is against the backdrop of Diocletian's reforms, as well as his persecution, that we can best understand the significance of Constantine's initiative. After a golden age in the Roman Empire in the 2nd century, the reigns of Trajan and Hadrian in particular seemed a high water mark for enlightened imperial rule, the empire increasingly suffered severe external and internal threats throughout the entire 3rd century, especially from 235 to 285, reaching almost a condition of anarchy. From the outside, the Sassanid Empire that lasted for some 400 years, from 224 to 651, brought Persian Parthian power to an ever-increasing threat or position of threat in the east. Its power reached as far west as Antioch in the 250s. We remember that the Hellenistic city of Dura on the Euphrates was destroyed by the Parthians around the year 250. And at the same time, Germanic peoples on the Danube and the Rhine River had begun those invasions, or more properly, the migration of populations, that increased pressure on the empire in the west. The empire was, moreover, in bad financial condition. Rome had always depended on new conquest for the acquisition of wealth. We remember that military leaders would enter into the city of Rome in triumphal procession, bringing all the booty that they had gathered from conquered territories. But with the face of victory progressively turning away from the empire, such easy wealth was less available. And the economic situation was made worse by periodic famine, plague, and chronic monetary inflation. From within as well, there was political unrest, with imperial pretenders contending for power. Since the time of Augustus, the usual way to become an emperor was through acclamation by Roman troops. The temptation to military leaders with ambition was obvious and constant. Diocletian was born of a family of low status around the year 244. And he also made his way through the military ranks and was acclaimed as emperor. He showed himself, however, to be an exceptionally intelligent and strong leader who literally saved the Roman Empire by centralizing authority and instituting rigid controls, especially of prices, throughout the empire. Diocletian established a hierarchical administrative structure with a complex bureaucracy. And at the top, he divided responsibility among an Augustus and a Caesar in both the east and the west. So there was an Augustus at the very top, both in the east and the west, and under the Augustus, a Caesar in both the east and the west, so that the empire was administered, in effect, by a tetrarchy. In addition, Diocletian devised a plan of succession through Augusti to Caesars. Secondly, Diocletian increased the size of military forces. To do so, he made increased use of mercenaries for the defense of the empire, a practice that broke with the ancient Roman tradition of a citizenry army, but he did manage to secure the borders and the Roman peace once more, at least temporarily. The third innovation, for which Diocletian is sometimes condemned, sometimes admired, is establishing rigid price controls and increasing taxes throughout the empire in order to improve the financial situation. To some extent, the control of prices and the collecting of taxes were what made that much more elaborate administrative bureaucracy necessary. Police control of the populace, formerly a fear only of those who were enemies of the Roman order, like philosophers and Christians, became a factor in the lives of others as well. Fourthly, with all of this came the further exaltation of the supreme leader. The cult of the emperor and the imperial family had become more and more prominent since the time of Augustus. And it wasn't simply imposed on the provinces. Indeed, cities within the empire competed to be the place where the imperial family was honored. The honor to the emperor and to the imperial family as divine was the essential religious glue of society. So through these reforms, Diocletian laid the groundwork for what scholars call the late Roman Empire, that in all but one important way would continue until 1453 as the Byzantine Empire, collapsing only under Muslim attack in that year. The last great persecution of Christianity, carried out under Diocletian, was also the most violent and vicious. But it was entirely consistent with Diocletian's policy, for he sought by persecution to make traditional Greco-Roman religion secure and uniform throughout the empire. Remember the premise shared by all ancient states. Unity of religion is the basis of unity in the political order. Christianity had simply become too large a counterforce to simply ignore or to continue to endure. Diocletian shot a warning blow against the Christians in March 297, not a direct blow, but an indirect one. He issued a decree against the Manichaeans. Now, we learned earlier that the Manichaeans were a Gnostic religion, dualistic in character, that combined Christian elements and Zoroastrian elements from Persia. That Persian element was particularly troublesome in this political context. So Diocletian issued an edict against the Manichaeans as a new religion that broke the tradition of the Roman nation. The decree said, "It is criminal to throw doubts on what has been established from ancient times." This was a warning shot to the Christians, and very quickly he began to turn his attention explicitly to this troublesome cult. Between February 303 and March 304, Diocletian issued 4 decrees against the Christians. He begins first by attacking worship. He bans liturgical books and vessels, and he burns churches. The logic is, destroy places of worship, you destroy motivation for gathering together for worship. His second decree called for the arrest and imprisonment of bishops and other clergy. The logic, cut off the head and the others will follow. The third edict promises release from prison for those who offer sacrifice to the gods. The logic, give back the clergy their religious power, simply ask them to change their religious allegiance. The final edict, of course, is the decisive one. It demands of all inhabitants of the empire, not just the clergy now, but all inhabitants of the empire, that they offer sacrifice to the gods at the pain of deportation or death. The historical evidence suggests that these edicts were vigorously pursued, and that many Christians, how many exactly is impossible to determine, lost their property, their social position, and life itself during the persecution. Diocletian never lost the capacity to surprise. He did something totally unexpected. He resigned the position of Augustus in the year 305, confident that his plan of succession and his policy of persecution would be carried forward. And his immediate successors, Galerius and Maximinus Daia, wage a continuing persecution up until the time of the Edict of Milan. It was not uniformly imposed, but the pressure on Christians was continuous for a period of over 10 years. In most respects, Constantine adheres to the same premises as Diocletian concerning imperial rule and religion. He saw as his first job to establish a unified rule by making himself the sole Augustus. You cannot change anything unless you are the autocrat in charge. At one point, in the beginning of the year 310, the empire actually had 7 rival emperors. It is clear that Diocletian's careful plans for an orderly succession had predictably fallen into disarray, the victim of human ambition and rivalry. Constantine was one of those 7 in the year 306, proclaimed at the death of his father Constantius, who was the ruler in the west. Over the next years, Constantine was sometimes opposed and sometimes aligned with the 6 others. His longest association was with Licinius until he became the sole emperor in the year 324. But Constantine worked ruthlessly with the help of his mother Helena, sometimes through assassination, to progressively eliminate his rivals and co-rulers and make himself the sole Augustus, the sole ruler over the entire empire. Only then was he in a position to do anything about religion. Now, Constantine himself was born a pagan, and he only receives Christian baptism on his deathbed. This in itself is not an unusual custom in those days. Since baptism took away sins, it was a prudent move, especially for politicians, for whom sin is an ever-present temptation, to delay baptism as long as possible. But from the beginning, Constantine clearly favored Christianity as the new glue of the empire. The historian Eusebius speaks of Constantius, Constantine's father, as a believer in the one God rather than in polytheism. But Eusebius stops short of calling Constantius a Christian. It is possible that Constantine was drawn to the religion through the influence of his mother, who became Christian at some earlier point. She had been divorced by Constantine's father, Constantius, but when her son recalled her from obscurity, they became and remained close partners for the remainder of her long life. The ecclesiastical historian Eusebius, who was also Constantine's eulogist, his Life of Constantine engages in flattery so extensive as to make one blush, reports the famous legend of Constantine's dream or vision before the critical battle at the Milvian Bridge, when he was fighting Maxentius for dominance in the West. In this vision or dream, he has the sense of hearing a voice saying, "In hoc signo vinces," in this sign you will conquer. And what he saw was the sign of Christ crucified. This was in the year 312. And before the battle, he placed the Christian hero, the first letters of the name Christ in Greek, hero, Christos, on his soldiers' shields. He won the battle. He became ruler of the West, and after his defeat of Maxentius, Constantine and Licinius issue a decree of freedom of worship for Christians in June of 313. They refer in that decree to an earlier mutual agreement that they had reached in Milan in the year 312. Hence, this decree of toleration is called the Edict of Milan. Constantine immediately moves to use his supreme authority to become the protector and benefactor of the formerly persecuted religion. Why did he do this? What was his motivation? There are three possible explanations. One, I've already touched on, the influence of his family, his father, and especially his mother. A second plausible reason is that Constantine had been morally revulsed by the vicious persecution carried out by Diocletian and others. Notice that when Constantine becomes emperor, he actually practices toleration for all religions for an extended period. The third reason may be the most plausible, and that is that Constantine saw that Christianity was simply the right horse to bet on. He was very impressed with the ecumenical network of organization that Christianity had developed with its provincials and its patriarchates, which so closely mimed the organization of the empire itself. Whatever his motivation, Constantine moved immediately to proclaim release from exile of those who had been persecuted and the restoration of property to confessors. And, even more significantly, property that had been taken away from churches under Diocletian was to be restored by money taken from the imperial treasury. Second, he issues benefits to the African clergy of what he calls the very holy Catholic Church. He exempts them from taxation and from performing public service. These are the same rights that pagan priests would have enjoyed. Beginning already in 313, Christian symbols begin to appear on imperial coins. By 323, pagan ones disappear. The state begins to recognize the decisions made by church officials as valid for that Christian community. It can make its own decisions for itself. The church can now legally inherit and bequeath property. All of these might simply be regarded as a matter of equity or fairness. But the real privileging of Christianity is apparent when Constantine begins the practice of taking formerly pagan temples and donating them to the Christians for use in their worship. And even more so, the building of splendid new basilicas for the exclusive purpose of Christian worship. We'll talk more about this later. The population of the empire was statistically by no means yet Christian. And as we shall see, paganism did not immediately disappear. Temples, shrines, and festivals continue. And traditional religion will have its adherents and apologists for at least another 100 years. But the actions of Constantine decisively placed the imperial power behind Christianity, with the expectation that the church would also in turn support a Christian imperial power. A fascinating figure who represents this historical pivot is Lactantius. He is a North African rhetorician. He is a Christian who, under Diocletian, wrote one of the last and longest apologies for Christianity, arguing for its legal recognition and the toleration of Christianity. After Constantine began to establish Christianity, Lactantius wrote a book called On the Death of the Persecutors. And in this book, he provides us with a range of reports on all of the various persecutions carried out by the pagan emperors, but dismayingly, also reports on how God punished each one of them for the way in which they were nasty toward Christians. All of them died horrible deaths. Lactantius's book on the death of the persecutors show us the beginning of the ugly side of Christian triumphalism. Constantine's boldest and most important political and religious innovation was the founding of a new Rome in 330, naming it after himself. Constantinople, present-day Istanbul, was indeed Constantine's city. Politically, Constantine recognized, as Diocletian had, the need to establish firm control over both the West and the East, especially since the West was under increased barbarian threat and the East faced the hostile Sassanid Empire and would continue to do so for several hundred years. He chose to make a new capital for the East at an ancient Greek city called Byzantium that had been founded in the 7th century before the Common Era, destroyed, and then was rebuilt by the Romans in 198 of the Common Era. The location of Byzantium, to become Constantinople, is ideal for the purposes of security. Located on a peninsula extending into the Sea of Marmara at the Bosphorus Strait, with the Golden Horn to its northeast, the city is supremely defensible. It repelled all invaders for over 1,000 years until the Muslims finally conquered it in 1453. Constantinople occupies the join between Europe and Asia, with easy access by water for trade and the movement of troops, with access as well to the ancient Silk Road, which enables trade to the east. It forms the capstone of the prosperous economy and the predominantly Christian population of Asia Minor. Symbolically, Constantinople is a new Rome that is also a Christian Rome from the beginning. Constantine uses the materials from pagan temples in the construction of the city and melts down pagan idols to acquire the gold which is used for the ornamentation in this new city. In the future, Constantinople will become a genuine rival to the old Rome. It thrives especially when the old capital is weak, and it challenges the old Rome for primacy in every respect. If the first Rome was important because it was the seat of empire, then the new Rome must be at least equally important for the same reason. But if the old Rome bases its religious importance on being the city of Peter and Paul, Constantinople cannot compete and should be secondary. The seeds of considerable later religious distress were sown by Constantine's political decision in this matter as in many others. In the next lecture, we shall see how Constantine's sponsorship of the Christian religion was put into effect, the resistance to this initiative, and the process by which the transformation of the empire was completed.
Okay. All right, that wasn't quite as dense as the first lecture, I think. A little bit more digestible. So, questions right off the top of the bat?
How brutal was Constantine, really?
I'm sorry, how what?
How brutal was Constantine?
That's a really good question. As far, in terms of being brutal to his own people in the way that Diocletian was, where he is carrying out persecutions of the Christians, Constantine wasn't anywhere nearly that brutal. But then on the other hand, what he has to do is he's fighting when he comes to power in a civil war because his rival is Maxentius. And so there's this long drawn out civil war, and it sort of climaxes at the Battle of Milvian Bridge. So you can't stay emperor and be a really nice guy. That's all there is to it. It just doesn't. It comes with a lot of you wind up with a lot of blood on your hands. This is one of the reasons why he puts off being baptized until the end of his life, because the idea was in the early Christian church that baptism washes away all sins. And if you become baptized when you first become a believer, you wash away all of your sins, but then you've got the rest of your life to live, and you may accumulate more sins which can't be expiated at that point. And so what a number of people did was they simply waited until they were on their deathbeds before they were baptized, because then all of your sins were purged. So you can see why this would be a good choice if you're Constantine the Great to wait until you're right on your deathbed to be baptized.
Does that not set a peculiar precedent?
What do you mean by that?
Like, sin as much as you want until you get to your deathbed and then be absolved.
Oh, that's really interesting. So, that's exactly what people accuse Luther of.
Oh.
That's what people accuse Luther of. And Luther, the idea was, well, if good works don't matter and you're saved by faith alone, what is to stop people from going out and just sinning away, enjoying themselves and saying, well, I have faith and all my sins are gone? This is an age-old problem, right? So there's potential for that. There's really potential for that. But the idea was, Luther would say the same thing that these early Christians would say, and that is that if you really are converted to the faith, you're going to have a change of heart, and you're not going to be doing things like that. Right? Yeah. So that's a good question. All right, other questions about what you just heard? Wow. Okay, either you're just stunned by what you heard, you don't care, or you just mastered everything. So let's talk a little bit about this. This is fascinating. I don't know if you're quite wrapping your minds around this, and that is that the conversion of Constantine the Great, it is a game changer. It's a game changer politically for the Roman Empire, but it's also a game changer for Christianity. There's no doubt about that. He did a really good job. Brother Luke Timothy here, he's a former Benedictine monk. Brother Luke Timothy did a really good job talking about those really harsh persecutions of Diocletian. And there were a lot of Romans at the time, we're talking right around the year 300, who are blaming the Christians for what's happening in the Roman Empire. That, you know, there's civil wars and that there's deep unrest. The Persians are starting to hammer away at the eastern end of the Roman Empire. Germanic tribes are starting to apply pressure, and the empire just simply seems to be falling apart. And a lot of Romans are saying this is because we are turning away from our traditional religion, and the gods are angry at us, right? This is the price that we're paying right here. And this is one of the reasons why Diocletian goes out and he just comes down so heavily upon those Christians, because if there's a population of about 50 million, 55 million people in the Roman Empire now, and about 6 million of them are Christians, that is a sizable population that you can no longer ignore, right? And so what he's trying to do then is he's trying to eradicate these people, this faith that is really looked upon by many as being subversive and causing a lot of the problems with the Roman Empire. And he institutes then, in a way that really hasn't been carried out before, not that there weren't persecutions, but he is systematic about it, and he really brings a hammer down on these Christians. It's one of the worst period of persecution in the ancient Roman Empire. And if this had kept up, the religion just simply might have been eradicated. If his successors had kept up this same level of persecution. But Constantine the Great doesn't do that. As a matter of fact, he puts the brakes on that. And he goes then, he turns the empire from, and the imperial administration from persecuting Christians to enforcing toleration, right? Not just of Christianity, but of all religions out there altogether. This is huge. This is absolutely huge, right? It really probably saves Christianity. And on top of that, not only does he say we're no longer going to persecute these people, but we're actually going to begin to favor them. And he talks about, Professor Luke Timothy talks about then many of the privileges and a lot of the wealth that the emperor begins to direct towards the Christians. Yeah, Bob.
So is it plausible, or does the sort of literature speak to how effective those persecutions were?
Yeah, they're highly effective under Constantine. Under Diocletian. Probably what saves the Christians at this point is that Diocletian steps down, and within a matter of 10 years, then Constantine the Great becomes emperor, and he refuses to carry out those persecutions any longer. But they are systematic, they're thorough, and they're wreaking quite a great deal of havoc with the Christians. There's no doubt about that. Really, no doubt about that. Yeah. Yes, sir. Tell me your name.
I'm Vince.
Yeah, Vince. Nice to meet you.
Did Helen convert to Christianity before or after her divorce?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Apparently, from what we can tell, Helen, this is St. Helen, or St. Helen, she's the mother of Constantine the Great. Apparently, she had a conversion experience before Constantine, right? And she has an enormous influence, as best we can tell, upon Constantine himself. She becomes, after Constantine the Great embraces Christianity, she becomes one of the foremost proponents of the Christianity in the Roman world. There's a legend that she travels to Palestine, and she actually manages to recover the true cross. Whether this is true in fact or not, it's the legend that surrounds her, and she recovers the true cross and brings it at this time back to Rome. And there's a huge chunk of the true cross in Rome that you can see that's attributed to her. And she also founds a number of churches in and around Rome as well. So she has a huge influence. At least the legend has come down. Did I answer your question?
No.
Okay.
And then what was the actual genesis of her faith? What was the tipping point? Because Constantine,
For Helen?
Constantine's got a big force in his life.
Yeah. I don't know if we know for sure what that is. I've never read anything about that. I just don't know. That would be interesting. But it may be in the legend of her, that is, the saintly legend that surrounds her, that they talk about that, but I've never seen it. I just don't know. Okay, so here is, this is something else that's fascinating. The legend of Constantine the Great He is lining up to engage Maxentius, who is his greatest rival for the title of Caesar in the Roman Empire. And Maxentius has a larger army. Maxentius actually controls Rome at this time, and Constantine the Great is in the north of Italy. And so Constantine starts to bring his troops down south. If at this point, if you were taking odds, you would probably put your money on Maxentius, simply because he has a larger army, he has a better position. The legend of Constantine, and Eusebius actually talks about this. This is where we get this story from. That on the eve of the battle of Milvian Bridge, and the Milvian Bridge crosses over the Tiber River just north of Rome. This is where the battle is going to be fought. Eusebius tells us that Constantine the Great has this vision, and this vision is he looks up into the sky, and this is interesting because it has to do with Helena, right? He sees the cross. He sees the cross upon which Christ was crucified, and floating above the cross is in Greek, I know the Latin, I don't know the Greek, it says, in hoc signes vinces, in this sign, that is the sign of the cross, you will conquer. And the legend that Eusebius tells us is that Constantine really doesn't know anything about this. He doesn't know what that cross means. He doesn't know where it has come from, but he has this apparition and he embraces it. He believes that there's some sort of power or something out there that is willing to help him in this battle. And the legend tells us, then, Eusebius tells us this, that he has all of his soldiers paint the sign of the cross on their shields as they go into battle. And the battle is fought, and of course, the way that it turns out is that Constantine the Great wins this battle, right, against all odds, at which point he believes then that this talisman, this sign, whatever it is, has given him the victory. And at this point, he decides that he wants to learn more about this, and so he begins to inquire, what is this talisman? What is this sign? What does it have to do with? He comes to understand that it has to do with his Christian religion. And so he sends for the Bishop of Rome at the time, who is Sylvester, right? This is one of the direct descendants of Peter. And Pope Sylvester comes and informs him about what the sign of the cross actually means, teaches him about the religion, and then he converts. He embraces Christianity. This is the legend surrounding Constantine's conversion. Whether it actually happens like this or not, we don't know. One of the things, there's some questions about this. First of all, outside of the telling of this story by Eusebius, there is no reference whatsoever in any of the literature that Constantine's men painted the sign of the cross on their shields. Now this, if the entire army had done this going into battle, we would probably know something about it, but we don't. That doesn't mean that Constantine the Great didn't have a vision and didn't perhaps, pray to this god or sacrifice to this god, or believe that when he did achieve victory, that it was the work of this talisman. I mean, that's quite plausible given the mentality of these people at the time, and that is that gods intervened on a regular basis in their lives and carried out miracles. But this is called, it's the miracle of the Milvian Bridge, right? And this is the legend, and it comes to surround and is used to explain, at least during the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, why did Constantine the Great convert to Christianity. I think Brother Luke Timothy probably adds a little bit more to it. You know, there's the influence of his mother, St. Helen. Also, and I'm not dismissing the fact that he didn't have a vision, that he somehow wasn't compelled to seek out the aid of this God. But also the idea then, why does he convert to Christianity? He looks upon this Christian network out there, and he sees it's a very vibrant thing, and he realizes that perhaps that rather than trying to persecute them, if you embrace them, it's going to work as a force of unity and peace within the Roman Empire. That's still puzzling that he would do that, because they're just a minority, and it's interesting. I don't think we'll ever know in this life why he converts.
To some degree, that's exactly why I asked earlier about the effectiveness of the persecution. I mean, if it was so effective,
Yeah.
Why would Constantine align
Embrace it, yeah.
with, in essence, what is effectively being eradicated?
Yeah. Well, one of the things, and I made this remark last week, during these periods of persecution, you can't be a lukewarm Christian. right? It's just not worth your time. I mean, seriously, are you really going to embrace a religion in which you may either lose all of your property or your life or be deported? Are you going to do that? And so the people who remain Christians in this period are steadfast, they're fervent Christians, and maybe he was really impressed with their degree of tenacity towards the religion itself. Yeah. Ron.
Was Christianity more favorable to the government than the previous religions?
No, not at all. As a matter of fact, it's almost inimical. Because the other, if you think about the other religion, the pagan religion, right? The Olympian gods, for instance, you have a god of war, Mars, right? And you have a god of Rome, Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, who looks over Rome itself. Jesus says, turn the other cheek, right? Jesus is a pacifist. He doesn't embrace war at all. And the other problem is the Greco-Roman religion, there is a complete pantheon of gods. There's a god and a goddess for just about everything. The Christians deny that there's any more than one God. That is the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. There is a lot not to like about Christianity if you are a Roman, and particularly if you're a Roman emperor, because it's going to undermine years and years and years and years of tradition, what seemed to work very well. So it's problematic. And this, again, this is, Constantine the Great, then it embraces Christianity, and it really is. It's one of those great turning points, and I don't think we've ever completely answered the question, why does he do this? Because there's a lot there to dissuade him from doing that sort of a thing. So, yes, please.
What was the earliest, I heard mention of Catholic, and I think it was probably the earliest temporal, like within a timeline that I ever actually heard that term brought up. What is the actual genesis of Catholicism in this context?
Okay, the church is not referred to as the Catholic Church until the time of the Reformation.
Okay.
It's just called the church or the Christian church because there's only one church. There's no need to differentiate between us and the other. And the Latin Church, that is the Bishop of Rome, the popes, they start referring to themselves as the Catholic, that is the one united church, to show that the Protestants are heretics, that they're outside of the one united church. But they typically don't refer to themselves as the Catholic Church until that point. I mean, you'll see it, but it's used just as he was using it. That is, we are one united church. It's not referred to typically as the Catholic Church, it's the Christian Church, because there's only one church. But it's during the Reformation where it really becomes, we are the one united church. We are the Catholic Church, and anything outside of us you're heretics.
And that's when it basically came to the Protestant Catholicism and duality was during the Reformation.
That's right. Okay, we have maybe time for one more question if you have it. One more question. The other, and I'll just point out one other thing, and then I'll let you all go. The other thing that he gestures to towards the end of this lecture is really, really interesting, and that is that by moving the imperial seat, the government, from Rome to Constantinople, this is going to set up a dynamic, not just politically, because in essence what is going to happen is the western half of the Roman Empire is pretty much going to be abandoned. All of the resources, the military, the economic, and the political resources are going to be put into maintaining the eastern half of the Roman Empire, and this is going to abandon the western half, and eventually, within a matter of about 100 years, the western half of the Roman Empire is going to fall to those Germanic invasions, and then you get the Middle Ages and all that entails. But the other thing that is going, so there are deep political consequences for this, but there are also religious consequences as well. This is going to set up a rivalry between the successors of Peter and Rome and the Patriarch of Constantinople, who, because the imperial see is there, thinks that he, the man holding the Patriarchate in Constantinople, should in fact be the head of the church. And Rome and Constantinople, the Bishop of Rome and the Bishop of Constantinople, are really going to sort of jostle with one another for a number of years until the 9th century, when they just simply turn their backs on one another, excommunicate one another, and say, oh, well, to hell with you, right? And they turn away. And I think it was only under John Paul, maybe, that there was a rapprochement, right? That the two churches actually got back together. Yeah.
Did they get unified during the Crusades?
No, as a matter of fact, the first and second and third crusades, they sort of tolerate one another, but with a great deal of suspicion. And then the fourth crusade, if you remember your history, you will recall that the Crusaders actually wind up sacking Constantinople, right? And just plundering the entire city. So there's a lot of bad blood there between the East and the West. Yeah, no.
You're obviously very well knowledgeable about this time period. Is that part of your expertise in teaching?
This is what I do for a living.
Yeah, I know. But this time period?
Yeah, that's exactly what I do. Yeah. All right, so we'll stop here, and I'll see you. We got one more lecture next week, and he will develop more the effect of the Emperor Constantine on Christianity. All right, thanks for coming.